Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and today I'm having a conversation with Dr. Aaron Perry of Wesley Seminary, affiliated with Indiana Wesleyan University. Aaron's an associate professor of pastoral theology and leadership at Wesley. He holds a PhD in organizational leadership from Regent, and he's the author most recently of Kairos Care, a process for pastoral counseling in the office and in everyday encounters. Aaron and his wife, Heather, have 4 children, and they're active in the local church. Aaron has been a pastor serving in local church settings, and he's also been a professor, and he brings a wealth of wisdom to this conversation as we take a deep dive into several different areas, leadership, especially the importance of pastoral care, and he shares many of the lessons that he learned from both combining the theoretical things that he's done as an academic with his hands-on ministry within the local church to bring some really unique perspectives to our conversation. I know I learned many things, and we also get into some really practical ways that you can order and manage your day to be able to be available when persons need our care and our support as fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. And if you're a pastor, Aaron has some really good advice on how to set up your calendar to be able to maximize your ability to serve the people that we have in our congregations. Also want to remind everyone before we jump into this conversation that my book on centering prayer is called Centering Prayer, Sitting Quietly in God's Presence Can Change Your Life, is now available via Paraclete Press. You can also check it out on Amazon. If you'd like to have some tips on centering prayer, you can still go to centeringprayerbook.com, sign up for my email, and I'll send you some email information on centering prayer too. Let's jump into this conversation. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Hey, Aaron, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's get started by a little simple introduction. So what have been some key moments in your spiritual journey that's led you to the present time where you're serving at Indiana Wesleyan and at Wesley Seminary? You're an author, and then you also do a podcast for the seminary. So what's been some key formative moments for you spiritually?
Yeah, let me give you 2. One comes on the heels of reading C.S. Lewis's book, Till We Have Faces. And that was a book that kind of opened my eyes to, let's say, the masks that we can wear before God and the masks that we're wearing and trying on. I read that book when I was about 20 or 21 years old. And that kind of opened my eyes to the different masks we wear to settle in, to put our best foot forward, but yet we can also get caught in wearing masks. And alongside that book, in that season, I was really coming to grips with the grace of God, that if my life was completely devoted to God, there might be some masks that would have to come off. There would be some masks that would have to come off, but there would be an opportunity to serve, right? Like I wasn't going to be indispensable to God's mission, but God would graciously put me to work in his endeavors, right? So that was a really key time around 21 years old. And then I'd say another key time was in 2016, just before we had moved to serve here in Marion at Wesley Seminary. We had been sensing for maybe 14, 16 months that God was moving us along from our church that we loved, a church that I think loved us, church that was doing effective ministry, and I think that my pastoral ministry was still effective there. But since the Lord was moving us into a new area, and we were grieving that as we're going along. But it seemed that things were really lining up whenever the seminary called and invited into an application process and saw that unfold. But just before we moved, maybe just about a month before we moved, my dad is diagnosed with terminal cancer. And it just throws that whole thing for a loop, right? And I'm taking back to God. God, this has been a process where we've just been trying to seek you, follow you, not put two steps in front of the other, put one step in front of the other. And everything seems to be lining up. And now this, right? We only lived about 2.5 hours from my parents at the time. And so this was really a challenging season. And really, and sense the Lord say to me, Aaron, none of this takes me by surprise, right? Like, you have been following me. I have been unfolding this, because I said, God, if I knew this diagnosis just 2-3 months ago, I would have just stayed put, would have stayed in the pastorate here, and or if I knew it 2 months from now, we would have already been moved, and we're not gonna, it's like this happened right in this time. But it was in that kind of in between time when it hit, it was clear that God was saying, you can trust me with this. This doesn't catch me by surprise. I knew the timing. I've unfolded it with this. I have reason in this. And so that was a season of learning how to trust. The next 18 to 24 months were spent, a lot of it on the road, driving to and from the Ottawa Valley, from Indiana, to and from Indiana, to see my dad. And my wife and I learned to see that as a wilderness, a desert time. But one of the things that God graciously gave to that is as a time to lean on each other. And so in the midst of the providence of God, you're seeing so many things surround that. This season allows us to bond as a family, to lean on one another, to sense that God can hold us even in those in-between times, those wilderness times. And that was really, in hindsight, I still look back at that time, still reflect upon it, still seeing the grace of God in the midst of it, shining the light of God into it. It's still yielding fruit as I learn who God is and understand who He is, and lean into the various graces that He's given to me in my life that I can lean into even today.
Yeah, and when I look at your research, and again, thanks for sharing that. It's like now it kind of makes sense. I mean, I know their latest book that you have, it's called Kairos Care, a process for pastoral counseling in the office and in everyday encounters. And how did that actually experience that you just said? Did you experience pastoral care during that difficult season? Is that what helped you to frame it, or did you already have some ideas? And how did that, going through that experience with your dad, shape some of your ideas about what really good pastoral counseling and pastoral care would look like?
It's kind of something that our family has always been around the ministry. My dad wasn't a pastor. A lot of people sometimes think he was. He was actually a principal. He was a teacher, principal, and administrator. But our family was always involved in the local church, and it can sometimes feel that ministry was the family business. I had cousins that are in this. I was in pastoral ministry. My brother Tim was in pastoral ministry. It's just been all around. So it's hard for me to separate out the care that was, I'll say, overwhelming, but in the good sense, from family, from pastors, because they're all shepherding kinds of people. So many are either pastors in the ministry or have grown up with that as part of their imagination and how you provide support. But yeah, we did receive pastoral care from our local church, some of the pastoral staff. We certainly received pastoral care from other colleagues here at the seminary that were just jumping in to walk alongside us and listen whenever the timing was right. Back in my own pastoral ministry, I'll say a convicting story that I had. I was out visiting a family one day, and they had received similar to us, a really difficult diagnosis. And I had gone out to see them, and they said, we're so appreciative that you've come to see us. We're really surprised that you came. And I said, tell me about that. Why were you surprised that I came? I said, well, we just know that you're so busy. And, somebody told us, don't ask, because they're just, the pastors are so busy. And at first I was like, who in the world told this dear family not to ask their pastor to come and visit them, right? And then I realized the Lord checked my spirit, and I said, well, I may not have used the words, but I told them with my actions. And I looked at my life, and just the way that I'm wired is, I want to bring everything out of the day, right? It's like till I start, till I stop, like there's no missed opportunity. There's no time that's wasted. And so I might not have said the words, but I definitely showed them with my actions, like, oh, I'm too busy to do some of these things. And whenever people are in the midst of tough times like that, they're usually not the ones who are keen on reaching out. It's maybe one of the reasons that James teaches us, if anyone is sick, he should call the elders, because we're typically not wired to call people together when we're sick. It takes time. But they were so gracious to actually extend the invitation. Would I come and see them? And it was so gracious of God to allow that conversation to come up, because I realized so much of pastoral ministry is about timing, right? So whenever people were ready to listen, and I wanted to talk about, the transition of moving, trying to show care and support to my mom and dad from a distance, they had a certain presence, right? They were they were willing and able to listen because they had some margin that they had wisely built in. And I look back, it wasn't always my wisdom. It was the grace of God, and sometimes things I've learned along the way. But just that availability of the pastor, whether it was in the office, whether it was having a little bit less of a rush, having some margin whenever I was doing shopping, right? Just the everyday things of life in the coffee shop. Having that availability of the pastor was often the context where moments of pastoral guidance and pastoral counsel was coming up and was being executed, maybe in a conversation or maybe over a few conversations. But it was really, that was the availability of something that communicated the pastoral presence of our Lord through, in this case, me, or maybe one of my colleagues or pastors at our church when they were serving me.
That's just a powerful story that you just told about I wouldn't call the pastor, he's too busy, and that, and you can think of my own life. I'm thinking, well, maybe that's no one ever calls me because they always say, oh, I know you're really busy. And at some level that could be a defense mechanism on our hand. And I've kind of explored some of that in my own life. So you're a teacher and you're teaching in these practical fields, leadership, preaching, pastoral care stuff. So how do you get that across to students? And what have you found strategy-wise for yourself? Because you just sort of said you're a self-confessed schedule filler too. Because one of the dangers that I've noticed in my work with pastors is, like I was just thinking, I was just talking to one of the people that I work with in my coaching program, and works 55 hours a week as a pastor, and that he had another career, and so he was used to putting in long hours. But if you pre-schedule 55 hours, you don't really have time to do pastoral care per se, unless you're going to be working 60 some hours a week or 70 hours. So how does that lesson that you learned, how does that translate to a pastor's calendar as you're working with students that are doing pastoral ministry and going to seminary, right? So, and that's what I run into on the Orlando campus. And so it's folks that literally have zero margin, and they're never going to have margin if you don't, you either have margin all the time or you'll never have it because it's just the way we're wired. So, how have you taken that lesson and, changed the way you think about time and how you instruct students to manage their calendars?
Yeah. A few things I suggest. One is ruthlessly guarding your Sabbath, and this is one. If I have a finger that points to the student with it, it's three pointing back at me. And I've learned that I'm probably practicing Sabbath well whenever the anxieties of the week and the frustrations of the week even start to come out on that day, because it's like, oh, that's the place where they can come out, right? Like I've finally given time and space for that to come out. So it's kind of counterintuitive, right? You're like, oh man, if it's coming out on that day, I must be doing something wrong. Like, no, that just shows that you actually need this break, right? If they don't come out on a certain day, it's not that they're not there. They're just gonna come out at, whenever they maybe just get internalized until they finally explode out. So I'd say really ruthlessly practice a Sabbath. I would also say schedule it in, right? There's nothing wrong with scheduling margin into your time. It's good. Leaders and pastors are leaders. They need time to think. Right? They need time to think and process. They need time to reflect. Sometimes they just need time to sit and practice a discipline. Richard Foster's book, Celebration of Discipline, is one that we take our students through our spiritual formation classes. And I've required it in my Doctor of Ministry class. And it's so important that you have to schedule in the disciplines. And so if you schedule in time to be silent, you schedule in time to be alone, then it's like you're already having that kind of availability to God. And God is the one who's able to stretch things out, right? So instead of if you've got hours set aside for sermon preparation, God is amazingly able to bring insight to us in 8 instead of 10, right? Or in 10 hours instead of 12, right? God is able to help us with those things. And the other thing is, if you schedule in some of these marginalized time, and there's the emergency thing that comes up, then you're able to do a readjustment. And it doesn't mean you're trying to tack something else on. You're able to cut something else out, right? Every yes is a no to something else. So if you're going to say yes to something, and sometimes you have to say yes spontaneously to things, you have to realize, I'm going to say no to something else. And so if there's measures of available time in your schedule, then you can kind of say no to those moments of availability for the urgent that comes up. So ruthlessly practicing Sabbath, so important. Scheduling in available times so that the margin can get the margins already built in is really important. And finally, I'd say this is more of a posture, but to recognize many times our culture values busyness, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like busyness can be the mark of an effective person. And I had a mentor whenever I was in college, and he said, Aaron, I just had to learn to realize my schedule book should look radically different from people who are out of balance in my church. And if they look at my scheduling book, then they should be frustrated. Like, why aren't they doing more? And if I'm okay with them being frustrated, then I'm probably setting a better model for them to have. Maybe one story I'd share on this, because again, that's the posture that I have to keep coming back to. I remember it was just the run of the mill day, and I'm trying to get my kids ready. I think it was church, but it might have been school. I can't remember. And I'm trying to get breakfast done or tidied up and clothes and all the things that are just naturally happening. And I remember it was an honest and earnest prayer, but perhaps an immature one. And I said, God, would you please help my kids to speed up? Right? It was just something like that. And
Yeah.
instantly, it was just this check in my spirit. And God said, I have given them to you to slow you down. I won't speed them up. And what a gift then. So the family that calls me in, tough diagnosis, what a sign of grace that this family whose entire life is getting rearranged is a reminder to me, I need to go at a pace that I can be present to them. And then it's a grace because maybe I'm slowing down, right? Like if I am attuned and attentive to the needs of people that are under my spiritual care, then God isn't the one who's asking me to live completely out of balance and out of rhythm with his expectations, right? So maybe some of those things that interrupt us are meant to check and challenge what our rhythm is so that we are slowed down to appreciate, to live in better balance, to live in better rhythm, to have better accurate self-assessment and recognize our limits, right? That the care action of the pastor is a means of grace, then I don't have to try and squeeze more things out of that time. I just go through the rhythm of it and recognize God is still being gracious to me. God is not speeding them up. God is maybe slowing me down. That's a good thing.
Yeah, that's really good. I always remember it's like what Bonhoeffer's, I think it's what Life Together. He actually has a whole little section on being interrupted. And if you, it's being critical for a pastor. And it's always interesting in that book. I think the chapter right ahead of that are about sitting in silence. But then you have this whole thing of interruption. I think it's so powerful. And I know like a growing edge in my own life, and I was just looking because I didn't really know how you were going to answer, but it's funny. On Twitter this week, and this is in early August when we're recording this, I just wrote a tweet. So I've been thinking about exactly what you said and about limits, and actually instead of trying to get rid of limits, actually just embracing them. And I wrote, busyness is often the preferred excuse for avoiding the deeper work God desires to do in us, for us, and through us. And I just love the way you just put flesh on the thought that I had this week. So thanks for that. So talk about the title Kairos. I mean, we're talking about being available, and that word is kind of all about it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be spontaneous, but there's something different about being of Kairos time. It's so talk about why you titled a book on pastoral care, put the word Kairos in it.
Yeah. So here's my confession. The idea isn't unique to me, right? If somebody looks up a Kairos model, they're going to find the diagram that I've built this model around, this process around. They're going to find it all over the web. It's all over the web. I tried to find where it actually started, but I couldn't. So somebody brilliant out there developed this, and I don't think it was specifically about pastoral counseling. I think it was, it can be applied to a number of just leadership actions, and it maps well into the church. But that wasn't unique to me. So I didn't invent the name of it, but it really does fit really well into what is so often, even what we're talking about being interrupted. It fits into the rhythm of pastoral ministry, because so often counseling, and when a person is asking for the pastor's guidance and counsel and wisdom, it really is about timing, right? So maybe you think about these different moments in life that just jar the person so that they say, I don't want to go through that again. Something has to change. There's got to be something's got to be modified and different. And of course, in that moment, there's a natural amount of energy and drive and motivation. You think about, early January, the gym is full outside of COVID seasons, of course, but the gym is full whenever there's those charged times. But gradually, the people who are there, they stop coming as often, right? And only a few stick around. And likely those few who are making a change stick around because they've had some support, right? They've had some things in place that have been able to adjust their schedule, get them there, keep them motivated, help them see results, right? The various things that provide support so that there is lasting change. Now, Kairos Care, I say, is the pastor has to be one who recognizes timing. Right? One of the differences between pastors and professional counselors is pastors are actually charged with the responsibility to know their people so that they're initiating some of these conversations, right? So they can see when it's a season of change, when it's a charged time, when the timing is right. You know, the people might come to the pastor. The pastor might also see, oh, this is a unique moment that's coming at you right now, right? Pastors are charged to be initiating care in different ways. And really interestingly, the only way that we become good at telling timing is whenever we keep time well, so that we're in good rhythm, and so that we have opportunity to see, right? We're keeping time, then if we keep time well, then we can tell the time well. We can recognize timing. So I can't, there's a number of stories in the book where it's like the pastoral counseling moment caught me by surprise. But you're like, oh, this is one of these moments, right? This person is seeking counsel. This person is seeking guidance, and then trying to flesh out some of the moments along the way, so that that initially charged moment, that initially charged event, that loses some of its power. But if you're going through a process, then you can provide support for a person to capitalize on that timing, right? To see the opportunity before them stretched over time a little bit and result really in some significant change.
And so, we've talked a little bit about the need to be interrupted, the need to have margin in our lives so we can do pastoral cares, the real need to know our folks if we're pastors. What would you say are some other maybe common mistakes that pastors make in pastoral care, or maybe shifts that they need to make in a mindset that, caused you to write this book?
In my conversations with students, I found one of two extremes was common enough that I wanted to address it. Number one is I would have people that would say, I tell my people, I have one session, I have one meeting, and that's it, right? And people are just discouraged, right? It's like, oh, I better have my whole story and understanding together if I only get one conversation with the pastor about something in my life. So I was like, oh, I think that's an error. And then I'd sometimes have students that would just be so drained from all the counseling they were doing. And it was maybe sessions that we're holding on to 10, 12, 18 weeks. And I would say, that's probably moving outside the realm of your expertise and responsibility, right? If you are not a licensed pastoral counselor, if you are not a professional counselor, then seeing somebody over that length of time is going to probably not doing them any good. And it's obviously taxing, right? It's obviously wearing on you. And so I wanted to provide a model that I had seen in hindsight, just very effective, I hope, and to God's glory, had been effective in my own pastoral life as it mapped into the Kairos Care model, which had been given to, or the Kairos moment model, which had been given to me along the way. And I think it effectively addresses those two errors, right? I say that this model can help guide a person through a conversation. One conversation, I think it effectively can. It can also be mapped out into 6 sessions, right? Or somewhere in between as you see the kind of the stages unfolding, or the moments in the process unfolding. But it also sets a limit, right? If in the book, I give examples of when there's natural points of referral, right? Sometimes it's really easy after one conversation to say, this person needs some support that's outside soul care, right? Sometimes you get to a point where there's clarity around what change the person wants to bring about, and the pastor says, I don't think I agree with them, or I don't yet know that I agree with them, but they're really persisting. Maybe this is a time to have them see somebody else, or perhaps the pastor believes they can help and support. There's a really clear desired future that the person has, but it's the plan just isn't being effective, and so the pastor can refer them elsewhere. I think the model gives pastors a number of spots along the way to see, hey, is this being effective? Am I faithfully discharging the responsibility of giving guidance and counsel to this person who and caring appropriately for their soul? And also to recognize, we might be shifting out of pastoral counseling and into pastoral care here. one time had a student, we were talking about referral, and they said, man, that sounds like you're just kicking that person to the curb. And I was like, oh, this is so good. Thank you for saying that, because that's not what it is. And in fact, if there's referral, the pastor's investment in the person's life might actually go up a notch in terms of time, right? They might need the pastor checking in on them, daily for a while or every other day in some kind of connection. They might need the pastor's presence to help them find a person to be appropriately referred to, and see, how is that getting started for them. Pastoral care might actually increase upon referral. So it helps to lay out the role of the pastor to faithfully discharge. It's not just a one-time thing, and it's not ongoing counseling. Both those are outside the best pastoral practice. But it also gives moments of recognizing, the pastor has a role to play and can be a redemptive person, right? Can be a channel of God's grace into this person's life as God's helping them to see a change and live at a different level.
Yeah, and I like what you just said, especially about, I feel like I'm kicking the person to the curb, and that in fact my life might get busier once I make a referral. What's your opinion or recommendation? In your mind, should every pastor have some role in pastoral care? I mean, because we seem like one of the challenges in the church, and again, it depends on how big the church is. I mean, the local church is, because obviously if if your pastor church has 5,000 people, then you're going to need a whole team, because there's no way that you'd probably even get to say hi to everybody that goes to your church ever, maybe, right? So how do you counsel students to find that balance? Because it seems like there's a need. The goal isn't just to refer people, it's to do legitimate, powerful ministry in the power of the Holy Spirit, which is the thing that uniquely we can bring to the table as Christian pastors. But so how do you counsel a person about the need to continue to have real skin in the game as a senior pastor versus like, oh, I'm just going to preach, or I'm just going to do pastoral care for my staff because there's just way too many people? What do you counsel for folks in those positions?
Well, just that if they have no kind of connection with people in their church where there's actual disrupted lives that are taking place, then everything about their leadership is going to suffer, right? How do they know the heartbeat of the church? How do they know in a macro kind of sense where God's Spirit is leading? How do they know what life of the people under their care is like, so that they can have a moment of proclaiming the word and preaching Christ to them without that kind of personal connection? Now, of course, it's not about scaling to have a contact with more and more people. It's about, how do I have an authentic connection with the people that are in my sphere, mm-hmm. right? And so for the senior pastor, that might be that might be the people who are in structured leadership in the church. Maybe some on their board, or maybe a few other friends or counselors, got guides to them that are part of it. Maybe it is their staff, right? But there has to be that kind of real life connection within the church that isn't simply marked by professional roles and responsibilities. Otherwise, it misses the point of pastoral ministry, right? We do become shopkeepers, or we do simply become CEOs with simply with a unique set of skills that's deployed in a religious organization, right? And that's not pastoring. Now, at the same time, as there are various professional responsibilities that go for senior level pastors and staff pastors all the way through, there probably are people that they are connected with, right? There are people who would seek them out. That in the book we talk a little bit about dual relationships, and again in professional counseling, dual relationships are frowned upon. But in pastoral ministry, it's almost presumed, right? That mm-hmm. the person is seeking out the pastor's guidance because they have a relationship with them, right? Because they've been on a team with them, because they have heard them preach, because they have been in a small group together, right? Whatever. Because there's a relationship, they're seeking out the pastor. So I would say, it's really an opportunity then. If no one is coming to the pastor for a kind of personal and a little bit more personalized set of guidance, then maybe the pastor can ask themselves, have I lost personal contact with people in my church, right? Have I lost a personal contact such that they have no sense of who I am as a person, right? There's just a mask, the pastoral mask that I wear, and that's all they know me as and by. There's no personal connection. And if that's the case, then there's a warning sign that probably should be rung, right? There's a bell that should be rung. There's a sign that should be heeded, that maybe I'm acting in an impersonal way, and even a robotic way that isn't recognizing that I've got some limits as well.
Well, I've been accused of being a robot at different points in my life. So like if you're, let's just say you're giving me counsel and I'm like, geez, Aaron, I just really sense that I'm out of touch with the folks that I'm serving. What is from your own expertise, what are next steps for that pastor that maybe they feel like, okay, geez, I've gotten way too detached. I need to make a shift. Or even, you mentioned you made a shift because these folks thought you were way too busy. So you had to kind of rethink that. So what does that actually look like in terms of a public stance? I mean, you mentioned changing the way you did your schedule, but what does that look like publicly, and how do you encourage folks to get more re-engaged? Like, what would be some tips on how to re-engage and becoming more personable if you feel like you've gotten pulled away? And again, maybe touch base a little bit, because one of the challenges of the last, 14 months is a lot of people had to do stuff on Zoom, and pastors at some level have gotten out of a lot of pastoral care just because they couldn't, right? You can't go visit the shut-ins, and then there's folks that can't use the text. So this has been a season where a lot of people have had to step back. So how do you step back into something if you realized either due to, say COVID, or just because of your personality, you found yourself withdrawn from the folks you're serving?
One of the best pieces of advice I was given along the way, and this was given to me in the midst of conflict, but it applies here too. The phrase was, whenever you sense conflict, is how do you kick it up a personal level? So there's conflict over email, I'm going to make a phone call. There's conflict over a phone call, let's see if we can meet personally, right? How do I kick it up a personal level? And I would say similar way. If you find yourself disconnected, you're not going to have a total rearrangement, but you find yourself disconnected. I'd say, who are the 2 or 3 people that you find yourself just leaning on in ministry, right? Who are the people that you say I rely quite a bit on them, and maybe you're at a loss for having, you can't go do lunch with them, or you can't pick up the phone call, and people can feel awkward on the phone now. It's kind of one of those strange things that's like, if my cell phone rings, I'm like, oh, is it an emergency, right? Like, so maybe you can't make a phone call, but maybe you can write a letter, right? Maybe you can take time, and rather than an email, which might feel formal, it's like, can I slow myself down to actually write a letter, so that it takes me time to write it, it takes them time to read it, right? That's a practice that's slowing me, and it's a practice that I'm investing. Now, maybe once that's the case, then you can say, is there somebody that I haven't met with for a long time that I can reconnect with? Are there people in my church that have just gone through loss, right? That I can send bereavement cards to, right? Do something that personalizes them, something that personalizes me to them. It's not going to be a total rearrangement of the schedule, but it is an uptick in the personal connection with them. I'd say stop and look. I'd also say slow down, so that whenever there's text-based communication that comes our way, can I read it slowly to see, is there more to this than what I otherwise might miss? Now, that can actually be practiced on social media too, right? So I don't use Twitter, but I'm on Facebook a decent amount, and I can find myself into that doom scroll, right? Like just going through. Sometimes I find it really helpful to read the longer posts, stop and read, TLDR, too long didn't read. I can get that, these are people that they say are my friends, but I scroll on by. Can I just, if I'm going to be on Facebook, can I challenge myself to say, I'm not going to spend 5 minutes just scrolling to see what catches my eye. I'm actually going to read what some of my friends have wanted me to read, because they've shared it with me, right? Whenever I take that posture that what is being shared with me, the person has desired that I would recognize and see and read, then it starts to already personalize them. And maybe instead of just scrolling by or clicking an emoticon, right? Like, care, heart, I take a moment and I actually pray, right? I set aside 2, 3, 4 minutes. I actually pray. Send them a personal message, right? Maybe it's not a letter this time, it's a personal message over social media, so that it's personalized to them, right? Those slowing practices, those practices that can personalize. And here's the thing, God is interested in his pastors being shepherds to people. That's why he called them, right? That's why he equips them. Are they all going to be shepherds in the same way? No. Are they all going to have you think of that prototypical pastor who just exudes care? No, they're not all going to be that, but it's a non-negotiable part of the job, right? Pastors are people who are put into people's lives to care for them, to steward them through, help steward them through life, to care for souls. And so it's a non-negotiable part of the job. And so here's the good news, if God is stirring that in your life, then God doesn't do that to condemn us. God stirs in us because there's an opportunity. And all we do is just say yes in the moment. What's the simple way I can slow down? What's the simple way I can personalize this, even with people that are in my life and leadership sphere right now? And then do that, right? Let God start to form our own souls. Let us let those slowing practices be something that God uses to start to transform us. And He's interested in us being good pastors. He's interested in all His people having good rhythms in life.
You just mentioned social media. You mentioned cell phones ringing. You mentioned getting text messages or maybe getting emails, and then even scrolling through Facebook. I mean, that can just be chronic interruptions and reactions. And I don't think I'm hearing you say anytime your phone rings or anytime you get a text, you literally got to stop and do that. So, I mean, maybe you are, and if you are, please explain how that works. But if you're not, do you recommend like actually putting it into the schedule? Hey, I'm going to check Facebook and have it like set times. I mean, like what are strategies that to implement what you just said without letting that literally just drive your entire day, which it easily could?
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't thought through strategies for that. If I think that makes sense, right? If you're a person that's one of the ways you stay connected to your church, and you know you can't stay connected all the time, then give yourself permission to have a schedule on it, right? I'm going to do it from this time to that time, right? And then I can recognize my boundary, right? I don't have to stay, and I can't stay eternally connected universally, right? I can't stay eternally connected to all the people in our church. I'd also say this can be a great time to teach our people how to access the pastor, because there are some people who will just expect, oh, the pastor, some people might think, oh, the pastor's too busy to ever have time for me. And there are other people that might say, oh, the pastor's never busy. They should be 7-Eleven kind of employee, right? Available 24/7, right? They should be the personalized version of 7-Eleven. And that's not realistic either. So there is a time of teaching our people, right? How am I available? When am I available? And like James says, if you're sick, like if you are in need of time, like this is how you can contact us, right? This is how we are available. It recognizes that we have limits and that we can live into those limits. Of course, you're absolutely right? There are times when I said earlier, every yes is a no to something, right? Every yes to someone taking your time is a no to somebody else. And so there really is an important aspect of having a well-balanced life and recognizing who needs my time, right? To whom have I been given by God in the time that's been entrusted to me? If you're married, obviously your spouse. If you have children, your children. If you say yes to people, it's a no to them. Sometimes
Yes.
you have to say that. Yeah, sometimes you have to say that. Sometimes you need to say no to the other people in order to have a yes to others who are brought more closely to you. Absolutely, you have to use that, and that's living into limits, right? I don't have limitless time. I don't have limitless energy, and so there's a rhythm of faithfulness that I have to become okay with. One of my teachers and mentors in ministry, he said, whenever the pastor can realize, well, this person doesn't need the pastor, they need Jesus, then my no to them is their opportunity to say yes to actually meet with him, right? The pastor can become a substitute for Jesus. And man, it takes some recognizing when that's the case. And early in my ministry, I would say there's a certain heroism that the pastor can feel about always being needed. Right? There's a certain comfort and affirmation that can come whenever we say, oh, I'm needed, right? Mm-hmm. Well, no, there's a certain humility that also comes and says, no, they don't need me, right? They don't need me. They need Jesus. And they're not going to see Jesus if I say yes to them here, right? They're not going to actually encounter him if I'm always saying yes to their time. So is there a science to it? Yeah, there's a few tips in scheduling things. Is it an art? Yeah, it's an art, and it takes leaning into some of the wisdom that God gives us along the way.
That's really good. And I want to be fair to your time here. So let me just ask you some kind of quick questions I like to ask all my guests here. And so it's easy. Like what would be next for you? And, is there another book you're working on? And what I'm really interested in, since you kind of just said you're a self-described guy that likes to not waste any time, I'm always interested in what's a book you're afraid to write, even in all your busyness or whatever. So, I mean, you can answer any one of those questions.
Yeah, I'd say the book that I'm afraid to write and you're already going to know why it would be, a daunting task, is some kind of like Augustinian philosophy of leadership.
Oh, yeah.
I think his approach to time is really helpful, and the postures that we have of memory and attention and expectation, I think that those map into leadership postures really well. So, I'm kind of afraid to write that book, but I think that it might be really interesting to marry those things up together. So that maybe is the book that I'm currently afraid to write.
I'm guessing that'll come with, you're still a young man there, Aaron. So that may just come with some more seasoned wisdom to be able to get, because it takes a certain command of multiple literatures to pull something that off. But that sounds like a long game. Is there a book you're working on right now that's going to be like a follow-up or a different, go back to you've written on preaching and even leadership stuff. So like, is there another book you actually are working on right now?
Maybe multiple ones that are just kind of in the Genesis phase. I'd really like to do a dive into C.S. Lewis to teach pastoral theology. Right?
Wow.
I mean, Lewis wasn't a pastor, but he really had his finger on the pulse of culture, and as a result, you can see how some of his thoughts influenced and continue to influence pastors. So, I think, is there a way to teach, about sacraments, about preaching, about worship, about liturgy? Is there a way to teach about these things from a corpus that people still have a measure of familiarity with, and that's already accessed in their imagination? So that's one that I'm kind of kicking around and seeing how that might get done. And it also allows me to be in literature that I find life-giving and intellectually stimulating. So that's not under contract or anything like that, but it's kind of percolating, I guess I'd say, and snippets of it make its way out on Facebook every once in a while.
Cool. So, and what does a typical day look like for you? You've talked about scheduling in spiritual discipline. So, like, if you're going to describe, it can be as personal as you want, or just be generic on the whole thing. But like, what fuels you? How do you set your day up with healthy rhythms? I mean, you mentioned Sabbath that really fuel you, so you can show up and be as powerfully present as possible and be at your best as much of the time as possible.
Yeah, a few things that I try to anchor my day and week around. I'm in the Bible in the morning. If that can happen 3-4 times a week, I find that really, really helpful, really necessary. Our family tries to go for a walk almost every evening.
Oh, that's nice.
A Perry family walk. And there's sometimes some grumbling. Sometimes I'm the grumbler about it, but we have a measure of discipline to do that, and it's just time together, and we're reminded we live in a community, we live in a neighborhood. Who are our neighbors? What are like? We see some of them that are doing the same thing. So those two things are really important to me. And I'd also say one of the things that God impressed on my heart. So I can also tend towards introversion, right? Like, you do your Myers-Briggs, those things can help us see things. And I come out, pretty much in the middle, but I do need some alone time with
Mm-hmm.
it. And sometimes, like I said, with scripture, I'm naturally reading scripture alone, but I've really, God has convicted it. I think it's become a good mark in our family that, can we learn scripture together? And so we're working on the Beatitudes. Can we memorize the Beatitudes together as a family? And so putting those kind of into the everyday moments of our home, right? Meal times or just traveling in the car, that the time in scripture, the time of just walking, being reminded we're in community, and then those things that can kind of get sprinkled in every once in a while, right? Is it at lunch? Is it at supper? Is it just kind of spontaneously? Like those little opportunities to reflect and learn together. And I've learned to see my family then as just a real means of grace, right? Like they slow me down. What a gift. Yeah. Do they keep me from going fast? Of course. Thank God, right? Thank God for them to slow me down. So those are things that still imperfectly applying, imperfectly living out, imperfectly postured towards, but that can be helpful for me.
Now, I love how you just brought your family into it. That's just really, really beautiful. And I actually, obviously children are a gift. They do slow you down and until they leave, and then you have to reorder your whole life because then you can, my kids are all grown up now and I've just filled my day up. And so I've had to relearn all these limit things because now I don't, because there's very few limits, but I just love the kids, and just reminds me when my kids were younger. So thank you for that great reminder. What would be 2 or 3 books? And again, this is the impossible question for any fellow academic, but you're just going to pick 2 or 3 books that have really helped to shape you spiritually, other than the Bible itself. What would be a couple of those books, Aaron?
St. Augustine's Confessions. That has absolutely been crucial to me. I'd say I started reading it in depth. I'm not talking, in original languages or anything, but just, a couple of different English translations, going through it slowly, trying to read long pockets of it at a time, right? Different strategies you have to read. That book has been soul forming for me and soul shaping, I'd say. And whenever you get acquainted with the text, and I'm still, very much an amateur with it, and it's written in a certain way, you recognize, oh, this is a person who's shepherding me, right? Like the written word that St. Augustine's given, that's shepherding me in a tough season of life with COVID and loss of my dad and those different things. So that's been really helpful. And then I would be remiss if I didn't say, I could probably pick 3 or 4 from C.S. Lewis, but Till We Have Faces is one that I go back to over and again. Very humbling text, very searching text. One of the great lines in it is that in writing this book, the book is split into 2 parts. One is a story of the main character's complaint against the gods. And the second part of the book is her retraction, essentially. And she says that the God used my pen to probe my wound. And there's always a probing of wounds, I would say, in reading Till We Have Faces. And then I would say either Great Divorce or Screwtape Letters. Take your pick, right? One of those at any given time is convicting, challenging, chastening kind of text for me. So,
really good.
Agustin and Lewis. And Lewis is certainly formed by Agustin. So that's there's some overlap that happens through them.
And just for a final question, where can listeners find out more about your work? Again, your latest book, Kairos Care, a process for pastoral counseling in the office and in everyday encounters. So that's available on Amazon, wherever books are, I'm sure. But where else can folks find you? Talk a little about your podcast, and we'll wrap the conversation up at that point.
Yeah. So the podcast is the Wesley Seminary podcast. We are at Simplecast, and it distributes out to a number of different places. You can actually get a free chapter of the book from Abingdon Press's website. So if you go in, they've got a sample chapter that you can read. I'm not on Twitter, but if our paths have crossed somewhere along the line, you can find me on Facebook relatively easily, and of course the seminary website, wesleyseminary.edu, indwest.edu, and you can do a search for the seminary as part of that school, indwest.edu, and you can find my email there. I love having conversations, right? Every once in a while, it's so fun to have and sometimes they're challenging emails, right? They're comments that are inviting further, critical reflection. But I love having conversation with people and meeting people through the context of ministry, and it is like that's a chance to get to know somebody else. So I'm always interested in emails. Perhaps somebody tracks down the sample chapter of the book and they want to hear a little bit more about it before they commit to it. I'd love to hear from them, right? I'd love to hear from them through email or on Facebook and chat a little bit about it and see if it might be a good fit for them and where they are and how they're growing in ministry.
And those of us listening on YouTube can see Aaron's email right there on his Zoom window. But for those others, we'll go ahead and put that in the show notes if you want to reach out to him at Indiana Wesleyan. Aaron, thanks so much for being on the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast today. I appreciate your willingness to share from your wisdom, and I'm always grateful for the work that God does in another person's life and how you've given that back to him and are serving others. So thank you for all the work that you do and the books that you write and the ministry that you continue to practice.
Well, and likewise, Brian, I appreciate you making the time available and giving me a chance to share and also hear some of your story as our paths are crossing, not as often as I'd like, but every once in a while in ministry, it's nice to catch up a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to thank everybody for listening all the way to the end of this week's episode. And until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be voices of hope in the world. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. If you found this episode helpful, would you share it with friends or others in your network? And would you consider leaving a review to help other people find this episode? All of the resources are in the show notes, so I invite you to check those out. And I want to also say, if you're interested in learning about centering prayer, my book, Centering Prayer, Sitting Quietly in God's Presence Can Change Your Life, will be released in September of 2021. You can get it already on Amazon. And if you would like information about centering prayer and some help getting started, you can also sign up for information directly with me. Go to centeringprayerbook.com. All that information is also in the show notes. I will see you next time.